Do you know what sleep paralysis is? You know that experience you have during sleep where you're partially awake but don't feel fully awake. This is what people commonly believe is caused by spirits, but medically it's known as sleep paralysis. No matter how much you try, you can't move. Your breathing becomes labored, but you can't catch your breath. You want to speak, scream, or shout, but you can't. You see everything around you, but no matter how much you want to, you can't escape. Thankfully, this state lasts no more than 1 to 2 minutes. Then you wake up. Now imagine this going on for years. What if you could never wake up? The year was 1988. Martin Pistorius, a 12-year-old living in South Africa, had contracted a disease no one could understand. First, his voice grew faint. Then, strangely, he could no longer speak. He had stopped eating and was in a constant state of sleep. No matter how much the doctors investigated, they could not diagnose the cause of what was happening. Young Martin was wasting away before everyone's eyes, yet no one knew what was happening. His illness, or whatever it was, progressed so rapidly that within a few months, Martin was confined to a wheelchair. Despite countless tests, no definitive diagnosis could be made. There were only theories. Under these circumstances, unfortunately, within just 18 months, he had reached a state where he could no longer speak, feed himself, or care for himself. He required complete care. Finally, the doctors, left with no other option, had to tell the family the harsh truth. Even though they couldn't provide a definitive medical diagnosis, Martin's mental state had regressed to that of an infant. He was now permanently paralyzed and bedridden. He had entered a state resembling a deep coma. From the outside, there was a body that showed no response, as if asleep. In other words, he wasn't dead, but he wasn't living either. In the doctor's words, he was showing only signs of a vegetative state, to such an extent that over the years, he had been unable to move, speak, or respond to his surroundings in any way. Martin had become a mere plant, staring blankly into space and moving only his eyes. The doctors had told the grieving family that their son would likely never wake up again and that he didn't have much time left. In their view, Martin was no longer there, and his body was wasting away day by day. Estimates suggested he might live another 2 years. Of course, there was a family in shock, overwhelmed by grief, unsure of what was happening or what to do. Consequently, since constant care at home wasn't feasible, Martin was placed in a specialized care facility for children with disabilities, following the doctor's advice. His parents worked during the day and went to stay with Martin at night. Watching their only son waste away before their eyes every day had naturally deeply wounded them. As the years passed, their sense of helplessness grew and their hope had faded. Their son, whom the doctors had given only 2 years to live, hadn't died, but he hadn't woken up either. So they had begun to believe that Martin was truly gone. Or so they thought. About 2 or 3 years had passed, but while Martin's body remained unresponsive, a completely different reality was beginning to emerge from within. About 2 years after he had fallen into a full-blown coma, his consciousness began to stir slowly, to open up, whatever you want to call it. And this transformation was like a light gradually illuminating the horizon as dawn breaks. In other words, it was happening very faintly. It wasn't like waking up suddenly from a deep sleep. It felt more like awareness was developing slowly. Of course, even if he opened and closed his eyes, that was all there was to it. His gaze still looked completely vacant, and his body wouldn't respond to even the slightest glimmer of hope. And as this began to happen, as Martin's consciousness returned, he found himself trapped in an unimaginable nightmare. The people around him were practically blind and deaf to his presence. They spoke and moved right beside him, yet acted as if Martin weren't even there. Trapped inside his motionless body, whether in bed or in a wheelchair, Martin screamed, begging for help from within. But not a single whisper escaped outward. He didn't know what had happened to him. It was as if he'd fallen into an endless nightmare. His arms and legs were no longer his own. He had no control over them. Worse still, his voice had vanished entirely. His awakened mind was trapped within his lifeless body. And unfortunately, oh so unfortunately, for a long time afterward, no one would realize he had woken up or that his consciousness had returned. Martin had become an invisible observer of the world around him. People were having their most private conversations right next to him, going about their daily routines without giving his presence a second thought, as if he were an object. While he was in the nursing home, everyone behaved with the utmost ease, assuming he couldn't hear them. One staff member, thinking he was alone in the room, sang aloud. Another practiced a catwalk in front of the mirror, and some, assuming no one would hear them, let out gas and talked to themselves with ease. He was an invisible witness. As life flowed by around him, no one realized he was a real human being anymore. And of course, their behavior wasn't always this tragic comic. After all, he was just a flesh and bone figurine. And there was no harm in hitting him, cursing at him, or even doing very, very unpleasant things to him, right? Let me tell you the worst part. Martin's body wasn't completely paralyzed, so his pain receptors were still active. Therefore, when the nurse, annoyed while cleaning him, slapped him, yes, he felt it but couldn't react. When the caregiver, bringing the spoon to his mouth while feeding him, spilled the food, it was Martin who got hit again. But he couldn't move. Could the fault possibly be his? Yet if a culprit was to be found, it was undoubtedly Martin. The one who couldn't move, who suffered but couldn't speak. To put it bluntly, the one with a mouth but no tongue. It had happened, and it would remain hidden forever. For Martin, however, these weren't the worst of it. Yes, what else could there be, right? But it wasn't that. One night, it was during another argument between his mother and father. As Martin stood motionless, the argument escalated, and he saw his mother overcome with tears. Then her patience completely ran out, and her pain turned to anger. And right at that moment, his mother turned to Martin and whispered, "I want you to die." It was these words that triggered the biggest scream Martin had been holding in for years. A scream no one could hear. Perhaps he too had wished for those words, but he didn't even have the chance to say them. I don't think his mother was heartless either, because death wasn't always a bad thing. And remember, his mother didn't know that Martin had witnessed all of this, that he had heard it. And so the years passed, but the endless nightmare never ended. Throughout these years, which felt as though they would never end, marked by awareness, silence, and stillness, Martin would develop his own methods to keep from losing his mind and to avoid losing all hope. If the outside world couldn't communicate with him, he would turn inward and build a life there. As he sat in his wheelchair all day or lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his thoughts roamed freely. What else was there for him to do anyway? Sometimes he'd board a spaceship and fly to distant galaxies. Other times he'd imagine his wheelchair transforming into a rocket-powered flying machine, visualizing himself escaping the room and soaring into the sky. As the setting sun streamed through the window, he'd watch the light slowly shift across the room, waiting for the hours to pass. He would spend minutes tracking a tiny speck of dust floating in the room or the movements of an ant, conversing with them in his mind. In defiance of the external world he couldn't control, Martin viewed even the smallest thing he could control within his inner world as a lifeline. And one of the daily torments at the care home was being forced to watch the same children's shows over and over. Just imagine, in some places this had even been used as torture in the past. For some reason, since Martin didn't react, the staff frequently sat him in front of the TV and forced him to watch cartoons or children's shows for hours on end. It was a symbolic act. For some reason, they just did it. And among these, the show featuring a pink dinosaur named Barney and Frenza was driving Martin absolutely crazy. Even if he screamed inside, "Enough already, turn that off." Of course, no one heard him. Another thing he could do was try to estimate the time by watching the position of the sun's shadow on the wall. This way, Barney could calculate when that day's ordeal would end. Even knowing when the thing he was forced to hear and watch would stop was a source of comfort. And this act of tracking the light, a rare achievement for him, made him feel a little better. But even as days, weeks, and months passed, no one had realized he had woken up or regained consciousness. They simply couldn't understand it. And Martin, of course, couldn't explain it either. So he had no choice but to hope. His situation was no different from torture. He was completely under the control of others. If his arms or legs itched, he couldn't scratch them, nor could he even say they were itching. He couldn't say, "I won't go to bed today," or "I won't get up." The food was tasteless, the water was hot. Nothing was right. He had become a puppet in his own body. And this situation hadn't lasted just 3 to 5 months or 3 to 5 years. It had gone on well past the 2000s. Yes, as the calendar turned to 2001, Martin had been trapped inside his body for exactly 12 years. For years, he hadn't been able to tell anyone his story or say, "I'm awake, I'm in control." Even though he was fully aware of everything, he couldn't make anyone notice him. But of course, there was a but to this story. In 2001, a glimmer of hope would emerge in the most unexpected way. One of the staff members who had known Martin for years and cared for him had done something during her interactions with him that was extremely rare, both for her and for others, and had looked into his eyes. No one normally looked into Martin's eyes, or even at Martin himself. But that day, she must have wanted to look, and she sensed something had changed. When she spoke to Martin, she noticed his pupils carefully following her and giving tiny reactions to certain sounds. Most people wouldn't have paid attention to such small movements, actually. After all, Martin sometimes had involuntary muscle twitches, but Verna felt like she was seeing something else. She thought Martin understood her and his surroundings. Then she did something that hadn't been done in years. It was such a heartbreaking thing. She asked him a question that hadn't been asked in 10 years. Looking into his eyes, she said, "Martin, can you hear me?" That question hadn't been asked of him in years. If someone had looked into his eyes and asked, perhaps the situation could have been resolved much sooner. After the question, Verna's heart began racing wildly as she saw the incredible sparkle in Martin's eyes. Martin was conscious. The family and doctors were notified immediately. Martin was rushed to the hospital and underwent various tests. And the result, of course, was a miracle that was hard for everyone to believe. Martin was truly conscious, perceiving his surroundings and trying to respond. For years, he had been said to be in a vegetative state. But in reality, no one had realized he was suffering from locked-in syndrome, a condition not widely understood. So while Martin was thought to be sleeping all those years, he was actually awake. Of course, even if this had been noticed, it wasn't as though Martin suddenly got up, started walking, and began speaking. But he now had the option of learning to communicate with his eyes. After all, people were paying attention to him and realizing he was alive. This was much more satisfying. At first, he had tried to communicate using simple responses, like looking up for yes and down for no. And this yes-no system was a godsend for him. But before long, technology came to the rescue. Experts who learned of Martin's condition would provide him with a special speech device. This device could detect the very slight muscle movements in Martin's eyes and convert them into digital speech. Of course, when you think about it, this method was slow and laborious. But the mere thought that Martin might one day be able to speak made all the effort worthwhile. Having been trapped in his body for 12 years, unable to communicate with anyone, he was now able to ask for water. I don't think we could have imagined this sense of relief, but it was clear that something good was happening. And as he practiced day by day, speaking through the computer had become a natural, ordinary skill for Martin. Starting in 2001, Martin began making rapid progress in this way. And more importantly, his progress wouldn't stop at just communicating. Despite having been immobile for years, he seemed to be slowly regaining nearly all his upper body functions. He had even begun to move his head slightly and move his arm in a somewhat uncoordinated manner. Given this, using the computer would also become easier, because over time, he would start using his right hand more comfortably and eventually transition from eye-hand tracking to the keyboard. Remembering how to read and write and relearning how to socialize were slow but incredibly satisfying processes. After all those years trapped inside, Martin was being reborn, and as I mentioned, as he developed his communication skills and gained self-confidence, new people began entering his life over the years. 7 years after his awakening, in 2008, Martin had set his sights on his sister's roommate, just a joke of course, and started chatting with her online. After such a long silence, there was clearly a lot to catch up on. They had talked for an entire year after all, and in 2009 they decided to get married. Thanks to this, Martin had moved to England. Yes, this nightmare that began with the nightmare story had dragged on this far. It had turned into a fairy tale. His mind had reached full capacity. In other words, his brain functions were no different from anyone else's now. Therefore, there was no obstacle in his way to learn web design or start programming. Yes, he would never be able to speak the way we know it, and yes, it seems he would never be able to walk in the sense we know it. But that wouldn't prevent him from making his life perfect with the resources at his disposal. Oh, one more detail. Some of Martin's lower body functions had also returned. In fact, thanks to this, he and his beloved wife had a son in 2018. That bedridden child, given only 2 years to live, had chosen life despite everything and everyone. Martin Pistorius is still working on software. He's living a happy life with his wife and child. Not only that, he gives talks at TEDx. Not only that, he's writing a book about his story. He's experiencing firsthand what it feels like to be misunderstood and ignored. But here's the story you've been listening to. Life moves from here to there with a little luck and a lot of faith. That's all from me for this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please remember that I do all the work on this channel by myself and can only make this happen through your likes and comments.